The Gallipoli campaign was the Entente's aim to weaken the Ottoman Empire in World War I and to move on to Constantinople in 1915 with the hopes of dropping out the Ottoman Empire. The British also felt that they could take the Dardanelles and support Imperial Russia against Germany on the Eastern Front and to relieve their burden of the war. However, the Entente naval operations before the landings ended in disaster, mostly through the Ottoman Empire's use of mines. Then the Ottoman Empire's Fifth Army, consisting of 5 divisions, dug in to protect the Dardanelles. After over 10 months of fighting and 250,000 casualties on each side, the Entente withdrew from Gallipoli and the Ottomans had a victory. From the start of the campaign, Gallipoli had many issues to it. British minesweepers failed to detect many of the mines, which sunk and damaged several battleships. Also, the British had sent Marines to sabotage Ottoman artillery, but many remained intact. The British Navy attack also included many outdated vessels that were not suitable to attack the Turks, as the Ottoman Navy was inadequate, but that didn't matter with Allied overconfidence that was combined with Ottoman shore batteries as well as the mines. The amphibious landings were a bloodbath, and the Anzac forces had hit the beaches north of their original landing zone. Trench warfare quickly ensued, and when the landings occurred at Suvla Bay to connect with the Anzacs, the Ottomans had greatly increased their defenses, which maintained the stalemate and drove the British away from Suvla Bay. The Allied evacuation from Gallipoli would be successful, and the battle would remain significant for the Ottomans as a last great victorious defense, and it would remain significant for the Anzacs as well for their bravery and sacrifice at Anzac Cove and throughout the rest of the Gallipoli campaign. Consequences for the failed campaign included Churchill being blamed for its failure by Parliament. Churchill had believed that 50,000 men were needed to win the campaign, while Kitchener had believed that 70,000 men were needed for victory, and the Greek advisors suggested that 150,000 men would be needed to win the Gallipoli campaign, but the suggestion was completely ignored by the British. Furthermore, the German and Ottoman generals held the high ground in Gallipoli's mountains against the Allies and had chosen great defensive positions. When Anzac forces were advancing at their landing sites, they were stopped by only 2 companies of Ottoman troops due to the high ground advantage. A common theme of the original landings was that Allied troops could not exploit any advances due to a lack of orders and Ottoman high ground, which resulted in the Entente digging in at the beaches, and a war of attrition came about as Ottoman reinforcements arrived when the Allies did not act swiftly. The Ottomans depended on artillery support from the high ground, which the Entente tried to take but would fail. But what if in an alternate timeline the Gallipoli campaign was successful? Some conditions that can be changed to produce a British and Entente victory at Gallipoli would be to change the Allied mindset regarding the campaign in terms of looking at the start as a purely naval situation. Here they will send proper battleships to the Mediterranean instead of sending outdated vessels, and there will have to be more sabotage to be successful against the Ottoman guns. We'll also have minesweepers pick up many more mines so that the battleships can enter the Dardanelles better. The British will also increase their forces to 70,000 men for the initial landings, as it's unrealistic for them to listen to the Greeks. Another condition for an Allied victory is to have the Germans and Ottomans choose worse defensive positions and to not have the high ground in some critical regions so the Entente can exploit several areas that are defensive by the Ottomans. Additionally, there cannot be a lack of orders for the Entente forces when they have a breakthrough, so if there is one, it can be successful. With these changes in the initial landings, more Entente troops are landing and are exploiting the breakthroughs of weaker Ottoman lines, but it's not going to be easy for the Entente to just take the Dardanelles just because the landings and early exploitations have been successful. Trench warfare would still ensue, but it would be further up the peninsula. I feel like the Entente would take the southern half and establish a bridgehead controlling everything south of Suvla Bay. The Entente could eventually take Gallipoli and move up to Constantinople in 1916 by pouring more troops into the campaign and ending a bloody stalemate. The Ottomans are likely forced to eventually surrender, possibly in early 1917, as Ottoman forces would have to be diverted from other fronts in the Middle Eastern theater of World War I to support the defenses of Constantinople. Bulgaria is another key factor in how World War I will go in this alternate timeline. In our timeline, Bulgaria hated both Serbia and the Ottomans and followed a wait-and-see how things go type of policy, as although the Germans had done well in the Eastern Front, Austria-Hungary had disasters such as Przemysl. Bulgaria had been negotiating with the Entente and wanted the Vardar Macedonia region, but Serbia was adamant that they would never cede that land. Bulgaria joined the war with the Central Powers as Gallipoli became a costly stalemate, and the Eastern Front saw further Central Powers victory in the fall of 1915. In this alternate timeline, Bulgaria sees an Entente victory at Gallipoli as imminent at the same time as Central Powers advances against Russia. Bulgaria could join the Entente in exchange for Ottoman territory and Entente support in land rivalries with Greece and Serbia, but the second half of that would be an empty promise. However, I feel like Bulgaria might just remain neutral and becomes pro-Entente, or at least helps the Entente occupy Ottoman areas without joining the war in exchange for that territory. But the main point is that Bulgaria does not join the Central Powers and does not invade Serbia, which will have impacts on the Salonika front that I'll pick up on later. The Mesopotamian and Middle Eastern theaters of World War I would end earlier than they did in our timeline, with Ottoman forces being redirected to defend Constantinople. But it's not just going to be an Ottoman abandonment of their lines and an easy British sweep through the Middle East either. 1915 and 1916 in our timeline witnessed some British defeats, such as the Siege of Kut from December of 1915 to April of 1916. But defeats like this may not happen on the same scale if the Entente landings at Gallipoli pose a more serious threat to the Ottomans in early 1915. There would likely be Ottoman withdrawals and no Siege of Kut, but the British would need to resupply their overstretched forces in Mesopotamia, so it would take a couple months for the British to fully be able to sweep through Mesopotamia. Overall, the British would see advances and possibly take Baghdad at the end of 1916, but more Indian troops would be sent to Gallipoli instead of Mesopotamia, so overall it's really unknown how the Middle Eastern theater would go, but I guarantee that it would be an easier British time in this alternate timeline here. An Entente win at Gallipoli will undoubtedly produce changes in the Arab Revolt of 1916. The Arab Revolt in our timeline witnessed the Arab tribes rebel against the unpopular Ottoman Empire in June of 1916. In this alternate timeline, things could go either better or worse for the revolt. On the one hand, Britain would not focus as much on the Arab Revolt with the Gallipoli campaign still going on, but on the other hand, the revolt might be moved up forward due to the imminent fall of the Ottoman Empire, and Britain could have every incentive to try to put some more resources into the revolt. Turning to Russia, the empire is more relieved, but the Tsar must still abdicate later on in the war, as he had a lot of problems that I'm not going to get into in this video. I've already made several alternate history videos about Russia and World War I that addresses some of these issues. But regarding this timeline, the Gallipoli campaign eases some of the burden on the Russian front as German and Austro-Hungarian forces are diverted to Macedonia. Additionally, the Ottomans being forced to drop out of the war increases Russia's situation, as now Entente forces can be sent in larger numbers to the Western and Macedonian fronts to fight against the Central Powers without having to worry about the Middle East as much. It's likely that the Russian Revolution would be heavily changed with these developments from the Gallipoli campaign. Russia has a lot of moving pieces in World War I that seem to go perfectly for the Bolsheviks to create the Russian Revolution that would definitely be changed in this timeline. There would also likely be an alternate Sykes-Picot agreement, as Britain is sacrificing more against the Ottomans and has brought the war to Constantinople's doorstep as the agreement is first being drawn up. Therefore, I don't think that Britain would be cool with there not being some kind of increased British control over certain territories. And which territories those are, I don't really know. What is for sure, though, is that it's likely that France gets Lebanon, Russia would be able to peel off Turkish territories in the north without the Russian Revolution, and depending on how the Arab Revolt goes, part of the McMahon-Hussein correspondence could be upheld, as the Entente is focused on knocking out the Ottoman Empire as quickly as possible and might just request some oil deals instead of exercising direct and indirect control over territory. As for the Turkish War of Independence, with World War I being brought so much into modern-day Turkey, it's difficult to predict how this war, as well as the post-war world in the Middle East, would look like. The Germans and Austro-Hungarians would still invade Serbia without Bulgaria and have a rough time of it because, the high ground and mountains and stuff like that. But the Salonika front probably sees Germany and Austria-Hungary have forces in Macedonia against the Entente and Bulgaria, considering joining the Entente to occupy territory during the war that they would not want to have to give up after World War I. And that issue might be settled at Versailles, or it'll just become another post-World War I conflict. I could not accurately predict how the Western Front and Eastern Fronts are further impacted in this timeline. How World War I ends with an Entente victory at Gallipoli, how it affects the rest of the war, and its effects are very hard to predict, but this is just my best guesstimation. There's a chance that if the Gallipoli campaign had been successful, then World War I as a whole might end a whole lot earlier than it did in our timeline on November 11th, 1918, with the Treaty of Versailles destroying any hopes of a post-war peace. There's a chance that so much could have been avoided, such as the Russian Revolution, a longer World War I, a terrible peace deal, and more, but we'll never know for sure. Gallipoli had so many problems with the campaign from the start that there was really no realistic chance of it succeeding despite all of these conditions that I have changed. But that's just one possibility for if the Gallipoli campaign was successful. What do you think would have happened had the Allies won at Gallipoli? Write in the comments below, and thank you for watching.